Today I'm joined by Sean Byrnes, the co-founder and CEO of Outlier. Welcome, Sean.
Well, thanks for having me.
So now my understanding is that you're originally from the East Coast. You grew up in New York, you went to school at Cornell as well as at Dartmouth, but you eventually ended up in the Bay Area and I believe in Oakland, California. So tell us about that journey.
Yeah, I graduated from grad school in 2001, which is the depths of the rubble of the dot-com bust. And so it was hard to find jobs in technology. I worked in Boston for a while. And being in the software industry, I felt like at some point I wanted to work in Silicon Valley, at least once. I felt like my family, my friends were on the East Coast, but I wanted to go and see what it was like to be at the center of where technology was happening, with the expectation I would come out to Silicon Valley for a year, and then I'd probably go back again. Because again, and even today, most of my family and my friends are on the East Coast. And then it's weird, I moved out here for a year. I started a company called Flurry, and then I promised myself I would go home again. I would go back to the East Coast once Flurry was finished. And I was naive back then. I said, yeah, it'll be a few years, we'll figure this out. I read too many newspaper articles about big successes. I'm like, we'll sell for lots of money after a few years and I'll go back East. And Flurry ended up being a 9-year journey in my life. And I ended up at the end of it married with kids and living here and really enjoying participating in the ecosystem. And so I basically stayed put. The other thing that happened was I learned it doesn't snow in the winter here, which was something I'd never seen before in my entire life. And I have gotten very, very used to it. So it'd be hard for me to go back.
Well, I think anybody that I've come across that's gone to Cornell or Syracuse, they don't miss the cold weather. So I'm not surprised. Once you come to the Bay Area, it's difficult to leave.
Yes, that is true. Absolutely.
So you've been in the San Francisco Bay Area for how many years now?
I moved out here in 2004, so about 15 years.
That is incredible. So I guess the East Coast is just going to have to wait.
That's right. Although now it's funny, I used to live in San Francisco, and then I moved over to Oakland in 2010, and I live in Oakland now. And I feel like what's happening is when I moved out to the Bay Area in 2004, Silicon Valley was still in the valley, so it was south of San Francisco on the peninsula. And then over the years, Flurry was based in San Francisco. It was one of the first startup companies to actually be based in the city. More and more started to be, and now of course San Francisco is where everything happens. So I moved to Oakland because I didn't like being the center of all that excitement, the energy. I wanted to be a little bit away from it. And now it's coming to Oakland. So it's like following me around. So my fear is if I move back east, it'll come with me back east. So I don't know what I do. I might have to go live in an island somewhere.
So it sounds like you're the one that's drawing all the excitement and the enthusiasm. So clearly you're a rainmaker. So Sean, let's talk a little bit about your startup Outlier. So my understanding is that you allow for businesses to be able to identify truly outliers that may indicate some change or something important. Tell us about how that works and why is interpreting outliers so important?
Sure. So I got started based on the observation that most businesses today have a lot of data, and they have some very good tools to provide insights and charts and graphs. The challenge is all those tools rely on them knowing what question to ask. So if I want to know how much revenue I'm making, I have tools that will tell me. If I want to know how many customers I have tools that will tell me that. But knowing what questions to ask is turning into the hardest problem in business as data starts exploding. It comes out of everything. We use customer relationship management systems and payment systems and analytics tools. And knowing what question to ask of them to find those emerging problems and opportunities has turned into the hardest part of business. And so I started Outlier to try to rethink what we mean by business intelligence, to rethink what we think we know about data and use those tools to invent a new kind of product that over the next 10 years is what we need. We need the business to speak to us. We need the data to speak to us. And so the way Outlier works today is you plug it into data wherever it lives. Maybe it's in clouds like the Salesforce cloud or the Adobe cloud or the Google cloud, or maybe it lives in databases, or maybe it lives in other systems in your own company. You spend a few minutes connecting us to your data, and you don't have to tell it what to look for. You don't have to ask questions. It brings those questions to you automatically. And in doing so, make sure you're aware of all those unexpected opportunities and problems. It's the kind of thing that if you imagine 10 years from now, if data keeps scaling, that you need the business to bring those questions to you, which is what Outlier does.
Yeah, it's interesting because usually when people think of AI in terms of data analysis, it's looking at predictive, kind of probabilistic forward scenario planning of what could happen if these conditions were to persist. Here, what you're looking for are essentially deviations from the mean. So when those anomalies are identified, how do you then allow for the business to interpret it? So would the data in itself provide enough insights, or does your system provide some sort of interpretation as to how that came about?
Now, you brought up a key question, which is that most people who want to use data in the organization, they don't have degrees in statistics. They don't even have expertise in analytics. Most of them are the salespeople, the operations team, even the executives. What people really want is to know what is going on. They want to know about the unexpected shifts they need to be aware of. And so what Outlier is doing is going beyond things like anomalies and even outliers to write up reports for you. So the output of Outlier is really insights that look like a human sat down and wrote up for you saying, hey, Scott, this happened here. This is why you should care about it. Here is a graphic or two to kind of help you explain it. Here's some potential root causes if you wanted to dig deeper. And so an Outlier insight is something that's designed to capture a business event with all the context you would expect from a human analyst to give you if they were to walk over to your desk and say, hey, I found something you should look at overall. And then the key part of that is it has to be easily accessible, it needs to be easily interpretable, and it also has to be delivered to you automatically. So most of our customers start their day with 3 or 4 questions Outlier brings to them saying, hey, Sean, listen, here are 3 or 4 questions you should ask about what's changing in consumer behavior or customer retention or demographics or maybe even supply chain. And so I can start my day deciding, okay, of these questions, which ones do I want to answer and be proactive in that way. So the key part is that fidelity part where nobody has time these days. We don't have hours to sort through dozens or hundreds of insights. The key aspect of something like Outlier is it has to bring you a handful of the most important ones automatically so I can decide what to work on them. And I don't have to waste my day just sorting through all of them.
Yeah, so just to put some context, in a corporate setting, the way reporting works is that you have some sort of business intelligence tool. Some report builder has to actually generate that report, that dashboard, and that gets compiled and presented to executive management. Here, it's fully automated. So tell us about the logic that you put in so that you can actually start to decipher the underlying variables, and how do you actually, from a contextual perspective, present that in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, that's the challenge. And that's where I think artificial intelligence is changing the way business software is done, is that historically you would have to create rules. You have to create rules and say, I care about revenue, and I want you to let me know if revenue drops by 5% and if it drops in California by 10%. You have to set up those sorts of things. In this new world of machine learning statistical models, you don't have to tell it that. You don't have to set those things up ahead of time. You don't have to pre-configure these. What the system is doing is looking at the properties of the data itself. And it doesn't reason like we as humans do. It doesn't think the same way we do. But it uses a very different approach that results in the same thing, which is finding patterns of interest, finding patterns that are happening in the data. So the good thing about Outlier and why it requires no configuration is that it doesn't need to understand your business and all the different logistics of your org chart and your processes to look at your data and to see what's changing. And so and the key part there is you need to also interpret that in a way. So the reason Outlier generates natural language to describe what's going on is so that you don't have to look through and decipher the numbers yourself. It'll explain it to you. It'll have charts that make it clear. It also has to show its work. So you may look at a question Outlier brings to you. Let's say Outlier comes and says, listen, there's an interesting relationship developed. It seems like people responding to this new marketing campaign are going up. At the same time, certain kinds of customer support requests are also going up. And so what's going on there? You may actually want to dig deeper and say, something's happening here. Maybe it's users are having problems with this marketing campaign. Who are they? Where do I find them? How do I go deeper down that rabbit hole? And so what Outlier, an AI tool in general, can do for you is bring you that question, bring you the context without needing to know about the business, and then you as the human can interpret and add the logic on top of it. So Outlier will never tell you what to do. You mentioned predicting the future. Predicting the future is a fancy way of telling you what's going to happen next, and that's very hard to do reliably. But to look at what's already happened and phrase it to you in a way that you as a human can understand what action to take, that's something that machine learning can do very well, and that's what Outlier does today.
Yeah, a couple of areas that I want to explore is one is the fact that you mentioned that it doesn't require the need to understand the organization, the business processes. I think oftentimes if you look at kind of the legacy business practices, cloud as well as ERP cloud, is that enterprise clients tend to actually kind of revel in the fact that their processes, their products and services are so unique that the software or the platform that they're bringing in has to be highly customized or configured. Here, it's unsupervised. It's allowing for the system to just kind of unearth and identify and optimize coefficients. Does that resonate well with the enterprise customers when you tell that value proposition? So that's question number one. The second one is around some of the use cases. I think you mentioned just one use case in particular, but if you could share a few more use cases as to how does this actually benefit businesses?
Absolutely. And I'll actually answer them in the reverse order, because I think I'll start with the use cases and talk about the reception of them. So we sell to customers that are going to be large consumer businesses today. So most of our customers work in e-commerce or retail spaces. They are pharmaceutical businesses or financial services like banks. Those sound like different kinds of businesses, but they all have one thing in common, which is millions, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of consumers that they interact with every day. And those consumers are changing. Their behaviors are changing, their preferences change, their demographics shift. And these customers want to know, as consumer behavior is changing, early indications so they can act on them. So maybe the competitive marketplace shifts or consumer preference shifts. It may take me as a retailer months to react by changing the products in my stores. It may take a financial services company months to react because of regulatory constraints. So the sooner they know about these subtle emerging changes, the better off they are. And so the typical customer of Outlier is an executive, an operations lead, manager at a big Fortune 500 consumer business, or a fast growth e-commerce marketplace where the premium on knowing what's going on is very high. I think to your point about receptiveness, 4 years ago when I was getting started and I used to describe this concept, I would get very funny looks. People would tell me that it sounds like science fiction. I don't think computers can do what you're saying. It requires a human to customize things and understand what's going on. And I think in 2019, that's changed. We have a lot of customers coming to us who are actually looking for this kind of solution. And what's changed is two things. One is data keeps growing to the point where organizations keep realizing they've missed something. They missed something really important in their business and their data. And their old way of thinking isn't catching it early enough. They need a new kind of approach because they keep falling behind. The second thing that's changed is our overall acceptance of artificial intelligence has increased a lot. All the news about self-driving cars and drones, the adoption of machine learning in various parts of advertising. Leaders and business owners are starting to think about this as a real option, a real opportunity. So there's no more skepticism, will it work? They believe it can work. And if you can show them very quickly that it does, they want to adopt it very quickly. And so that's also why Outlier needs to be able to have a time to value of just a few days, that you connect it to your data set. Tomorrow, you get insights the next day. That has to be how fast it is. Because in this new generation of AI, if it takes months to get any sort of value, like with traditional data tools, people probably won't wait. Though there's too much skepticism about will it work, won't it work. But if you can deliver a very fast return on that investment, that you set it up one day and you get value in the next few days, why wouldn't you try it? You'd see if it works. And once you see it working, this is great. Now you want to invest more into it as well.
Yeah, so I want to focus on a couple of things. One is around the time horizon. So typically, businesses are reactive in the sense that by the time something happens, it's historical, and they're having to respond to something that happened maybe weeks or even months ago, because the reporting mechanism is on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually. Here, what we're talking about is the ability to actually receive almost real-time notifications as to what's happening in their business now. And for them to allow for a quick optimization and changes and calibration that could potentially, if they don't act upon, could cost them millions of dollars. The other thing I want to talk or ask you a little bit is around signal processing and the noise. Because you're looking for deviation from the norm, there could be quite a bit depending on the circumstance. So let's say in the case of a macroeconomic situation where you have kind of like what we're seeing with tariffs and things happening abroad and so forth, you have a lot of things that could cause volatility from the kind of the average. How do you know what's important versus what's not important?
Those are both good questions, and let me answer them at the same time. So you're right that most companies' reporting is delayed. And a lot of that is that human intervention of providing interpretation, selection, rules, and structuring on the data to take the raw material of data and turn it into the reports people expect. Outlier is typically plugged into that raw data itself. So the point of sale terminal data from a retailer or the raw credit card transactions from a credit card company. And that data is constantly being generated. And instead of relying on a human to look through, structure, and turn into reports, Outlier is looking through that itself. And it's important because in that raw data, that's where these unexpected things are hiding. The reports we generate from it are the expected things, the things we know to look for. And so by definition, the kind of things that might surprise us are probably living in the raw data because we didn't know they were important, so we didn't go through the process of structuring and reporting on them. So it means that organizations that are used to doing much slower decision process can actually get insights much more quickly because they're not limited by the infrastructure they've set up. They're just limited by the data they have, which is being generated constantly. To your point about fidelity, I mean, that's the core difference between Outlier and automated business analysis and traditional approaches, things like anomaly detection. So anomaly detection is a technique that's existed for decades. We studied it when I was back in grad school 20 years ago. And it was designed around a world of sensors. So you have a temperature sensor. Temperature should hopefully be pretty consistent, and anomaly detection is good at finding when things deviate from that norm. The problem is business data is messy, it's noisy, consumers are fickle, things are happening. An anomaly detection system at scale would generate in business data about 2% anomalous data on any given day. So if you have 4 million dimensions of your data, think about customers by age and gender, location, products, the millions and millions of permutations of customers on any given day, if 2% of them are anomalous, that's 80,000 different things I could look at, and that's just too much for a person. So the difference between that and automated business analysis is that automated business analysis is looking for larger patterns, bigger trends. How are things related? If, for example, I change my website, that may result in higher conversions. It also may result in more customer support requests because people are confused. It may result in more customer churn. It may result in higher purchase values. Those are all part of the same story. Those aren't different things that happen. And so in writing larger patterns, larger reports about bigger things, you capture more. So instead of writing a dozen different anomalies, you have a bigger picture. At the same time, Outlier has gotten very good at understanding what humans find interesting. And so as a result, it's this kind of system that can look across this expansive data and have a pretty good idea of what you will find interesting for you. So instead of forcing you to look through 50 or 60 different things, it can pull the 5 or 6 out that is most useful for you. And it does that. We use over a dozen forms of machine learning in different parts of our platform. So it's not easy. It's definitely takes a long time for us to build a platform to do this. But the good news is the customer doesn't have to worry about that. The platform's out there right now. It works. And we don't actually talk about AI very much with our customers because what they care about at the end of the day is value. What does it do? Whether or not we use AI or we use magic, and I have a bunch of elves in a room, they really don't care about that more than just the end result. And be able to show them the end result that quickly is good because I could explain to you, I could spend hours of Lakeport explaining what Outlier is going to do, why it will produce high fidelity insights. But if a customer can add their data and see for themselves, a day or two later, that means more than all the explanation in the world.
Yeah, great explanation. So let's shift the conversation to talk about your prior startup. And the reason it's interesting for me is that in reading one of the articles I was covering, you had started Flurry during 2008, which was at the height of the Great Recession. And apparently you guys went through almost 3 potential events of almost insolvencies. And yet you managed to come out and be acquired by Yahoo in the upwards of over $300 million. That must have been quite a tumultuous journey. Can you share a little bit about that, particularly from the perspective of some of the lessons learned in terms of innovation, but also survivability, and also how do we actually, have the resiliency and creativity?
No, it's exactly true. So just Flurry, actually, I started in 2005. But when we started in 2005, it was a different business. So Flurry in 2005 was a mobile app company. We built apps, but there was no smartphones back then. So we're talking about building apps for phones like the Motorola Razr flip phone and really primitive feature phones. And the journey of Flurry was interesting because we were building apps before people were really thinking about phones as computers. But we had this vision that there would be a generation of mobile services that people would use in their phone the same way we use Google on the computer. And we launched that actually in 2006. That was an abysmal failure. People in the US we weren't ready to think about phones as computers yet. We were figuring out text messaging and voice. But what turned out is we had built productivity apps. So think about email and news reading on your phone. At the time, the only way to get that on your phone was to buy a BlackBerry, and they were very expensive. What ended up happening was we inadvertently solved a different problem than we set out to. We ended up becoming one of the fastest growing applications in the developing world, in places like India and Indonesia and Malaysia, because there they had the same phones that we had here in the US, but they didn't have computers at home. They didn't have internet connections. And so if they had an email address, the only way to check their email was to go to an internet cafe. And here was Flurry building a service that allowed them to check that email on their phone, whatever kind of phone they had. It became a very popular growth mechanism. So much so that we had to build our own analytics, we had to build our own advertising infrastructure to support the app because nobody had done this before. There had never been large-scale mobile app companies in these kind of feature phones. And then to your point, in 2007, a big thing happened, which is the iPhone was launched, which was great. It came out to kind of revolutionize the industry. But if you watch the launch video, Steve Jobs is saying, listen, the iPhone will never run apps. It'll only run what they call web widgets. And here was Flurry as a native app company building native apps on feature phones, where Steve Jobs is on stage saying that world is ending, the future is the web and mobile, which was scary. Luckily, in 2008, they decided to change their mind. They launched the App Store, and Google fell over the Android market. And we decided to take the platform we had built to run our own apps, those analytics and ad platform, and make it available to developers on these smartphone platforms. And we were luckily there at ground zero with a platform we had developed over 3 years of using ourselves that became the de facto standard in that industry over the ensuing time before we sold the company. So at its peak, when we got sold, I think Flurry was in use by over 2 million apps. Most of the apps in all the app stores were using the Flurry platform. It was very exciting. I think in terms of what you said, it wasn't a straight line. This was a very up and down venture. So Flurry was insolvent twice, meaning we had $0 in our bank account. I didn't get paid for most of that journey of the company. People always look at the end and they think about success as a straight line, but when we were starting in mobile in 2005, people thought it was a bad idea. At the time, Verizon and AT&T in the US and carriers around the world had strangleholds in the industry. People don't remember it took Apple's strength in the market and the iPhone to break the stranglehold the carriers had on what you did on your phone and where it could go. And even then, like I said, we had a platform here that Steve Jobs was telling that the world was not useful. I think what I learned along that journey was persistence is important. In general, it's the defining characteristic of success. Whether or not you give up is a big factor in how successful you can be. In those early days, there were a lot of competitors to Flurry, but all of them fell away at one point. We ended up being one of the few that survived, which is why we were able to win so large when the market did arrive. The second is that you're right, the financial crisis hit in the middle of that journey in 2008. And I think one of the things that I've always been true in this world is very capital efficient. I don't like spending a lot of money. I want to grow as cheaply as possible. And the reason that Flurry survived that financial crisis was that capital efficiency, that we were so lean in how we operated, doing so much with so little, that while everybody else around us, all the other venture-backed companies were having trouble raising money and were going out of business, we survived, and we were the only one left. So survival became a competitive advantage in that market as well. That's something I still do today because there will be another macroeconomic correction. Who knows when it will happen? It could be next year, it could be 5 years from now, but being ready for it means that you built a business that doesn't rely on the market always being there for you. I think the third thing that I learned, and this is really important, is that we survived at Flurry because we had a pathological focus on just mobile apps. There were a lot of companies out there that were trying to do everything. They wanted to support mobile web and mobile apps and apps on the computer and apps everywhere else. And we stayed focused on the best experience we could have for this specific kind of customer and developer of mobile apps on iOS and Android. And that focus was why we were able to win in a market of much larger companies. Businesses, there were much larger businesses in the analytics space. There were much larger businesses in advertising. But we retained so much focus on just the one thing we wanted to do that we were able to beat them because they could only do so much. If you're in 5 or 6 lines of business, there's only so much you can do for any one of them before you get distracted and have to jump to the others. But we only did one thing, and that ended up being one of the big reasons we were able to become so large instead of being taken out by the bigger players in the space. Was that focus that happened.
Great advice. We only have 1 minute left. Any additional pieces of advice that you'll give to entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs?
I will tell you the best piece of advice I've ever gotten is that when it gets hard, and it gets hard, creating anything new is very hard. In those dark days when you wonder, are you doing it wrong? Is it you? Why does everyone else seem to have it easier when they start companies and create products? I will assure you that it is not you. It is just hard. Everybody struggles. If you read the newspaper or you read the news too often, you might think that everybody has an easy button for success, that you start a company and you sell it next year for $1 billion. And I assure you, everyone struggles with it. Some people cover it and hide it better than others, but we all struggle with it. So in those days where you feel like it's hard, when you wonder if you are making progress or if you're really working on the right thing, don't wonder if it's you. It's not you. It's just hard. And those of us that can find some success and persist will find success, but it'll be in spite of it being hard, not because there's some sort of strange shortcut that you can take.
Very practical. Terrific. So on that note, I've been joined by Sean Byrnes, co-founder and CEO of Outlier. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much for having me.